30 years ago, buying a cheap car was completely normal in America. If you were a student, a young worker, or a family trying to save money, you did not need $40,000 or $50,000 to get reliable transportation. You could walk into a dealership and find something simple, dependable, and affordable. Cars like the Toyota Corolla, the Honda Civic, or the Nissan Versa were built exactly for that purpose. In the mid-2000s, a brand new Toyota Corolla could cost around $15,000. A basic Honda Civic was often under $18,000. These were not luxury cars. They were transportation for ordinary people. But something strange has happened over the last 2 decades. The cheap car is slowly disappearing. Today, the average price of a new vehicle in the United States is around $48,000. 20 years ago, that number was closer to $22,000. And if you try to find a brand new car under $20,000 today, the list is almost empty. Talk to mechanics, and they will tell you the same thing. If you want a simple, cheap car, buy it now. Because the era of the affordable car is quietly coming to an end. One of the biggest reasons cheap cars are disappearing has nothing to do with engines, design, or what buyers want. It comes from regulation. Over the last decade, new safety rules have slowly added more mandatory technology to every vehicle sold in the United States. Each rule sounds reasonable by itself, but together they quietly push the price of the cheapest cars higher. A clear example is the backup camera mandate. In 2014, regulators finalized a rule called Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 111. It required every new vehicle to include a rear visibility system. By 2018, every car sold in America had to include a backup camera. According to estimates from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, that single rule added well over $100 to the production cost of each vehicle. Now another regulation is coming. It is called Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 127, which will require automatic emergency braking on all new passenger vehicles by 2029. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration estimates that the technology could add anywhere from $350 to more than $1,000 per vehicle. For expensive cars, that increase is small. But for the cheapest vehicles on the market, every added requirement pushes the entry price higher. Regulation is only part of the story. The other reason cheap cars are disappearing is much simpler. Automakers have quietly decided they do not want to build them anymore. Over the last decade, several major manufacturers have pulled out of the affordable sedan market entirely. In 2018, Ford announced it would stop selling nearly all traditional passenger cars in the United States. That decision eliminated models like the Ford Fiesta, the Ford Focus, and the Ford Taurus from its lineup. A year later, General Motors followed the same path. In 2019, the company discontinued the Chevrolet Cruze, one of the last affordable compact sedans in its portfolio. The reason comes down to simple math. Small economy cars generate very little profit for automakers. Industry analysts estimate that many entry-level sedans deliver margins of only 3 to 5% per vehicle. When factories, supply chains, and engineering budgets are limited, companies naturally shift production toward vehicles that make far more money. And in today's market, cheap sedans rarely win that competition. The shift away from cheap cars becomes even clearer when you follow the money. For automakers, the modern SUV and pickup truck has become one of the most profitable products in the entire manufacturing industry. While small sedans often generate margins of only 3 to 5%, larger vehicles can deliver dramatically higher returns. In many cases, SUVs and trucks produce margins closer to 15 or even 20% per vehicle. That difference changes how companies design their entire lineup. Look at some of the most successful vehicles in America today. The Ford F-150 has been the best-selling vehicle in the United States for decades. Models like the Toyota RAV4 and the Chevrolet Silverado dominate dealership lots across the country. From a business perspective, the decision is obvious. If a factory can build one cheap sedan that makes a few $100s, or one large truck that makes several thousand, the industry will naturally move toward the more profitable option. Over time, that shift slowly squeezes the cheapest cars out of the market. But one event accelerated this shift faster than almost anyone expected: the global semiconductor shortage. Modern vehicles rely on dozens of small computer chips to control everything from engine timing to safety systems and infotainment screens. When the supply of those chips collapsed in 2021, automakers around the world suddenly faced a difficult choice. They could not build every vehicle they normally produced. So manufacturers began prioritizing the vehicles that generated the most revenue. Instead of using their limited supply of semiconductors to build inexpensive compact cars, many companies focused on trucks, large SUVs, and premium models that produced far higher profits. According to the consulting firm AlixPartners, the global chip shortage ultimately cost the auto industry more than $210 billion in lost revenue. In response, companies adjusted their strategies. Ford Motor Company concentrated production on trucks like the Ford F-150, while General Motors directed limited components toward its most profitable SUVs. Cheap cars simply could not compete in that environment. But there is another force quietly reshaping the car market: government policy. In recent years, lawmakers have begun aggressively pushing the transition toward electric vehicles. One of the biggest examples is the Inflation Reduction Act, passed in 2022. The law offers buyers up to $7,500 in federal tax credits for qualifying electric vehicles. On paper, the goal is simple: accelerate the shift away from gasoline. But policies like this also change how automakers invest their money. Building electric vehicles requires enormous capital. Battery factories, new supply chains, new platforms, new software systems. Companies are now pouring billions into EV development in order to qualify for subsidies and meet future regulations. And batteries alone already represent 30 to 40% of the total cost of an electric vehicle. So manufacturers are focusing their resources on higher-priced vehicles where those costs can actually be absorbed. That leaves very little incentive to keep developing cheap gasoline cars. Slowly, the market begins to shift. Electric vehicles are being pushed forward by policy, and the simple, inexpensive gas cars that once defined the entry-level market are quietly being pushed aside. But one of the strangest forces behind this shift is a rule most drivers have never heard of. It's called the Corporate Average Fuel Economy, often shortened to CAFE. These regulations were originally designed to make vehicles more fuel efficient. But in 2011, the rules were redesigned around something called a vehicle footprint, essentially the size of the car measured by the distance between its wheels. And this is where things get interesting. Under the footprint system, larger vehicles are given easier fuel economy targets. In other words, the bigger the vehicle, the lower the efficiency requirement it has to meet. That creates a powerful incentive for automakers. If a company stretches a vehicle slightly wider or longer, it can suddenly qualify for a less demanding standard. And when engineers are already struggling to meet emissions and efficiency targets, that small design change can make compliance much easier. Over time, the result has quietly reshaped the market. Sedans became crossovers, crossovers became SUVs, and vehicles across the entire industry slowly grew larger. On paper, companies were meeting efficiency regulations. But in practice, the rules were making small cars harder to build, and big vehicles easier to justify. And on top of everything else, the cost of building cars is rising fast. One major factor is labor. In 2023, the Union United Auto Workers negotiated a new contract with major automakers that will raise wages roughly 25% over 4 years. Higher wages mean higher manufacturing costs, and those costs eventually show up in the final price of the vehicle. But labor is only part of the story. Materials, electronics, safety systems, and supply chains have all become more expensive over the past few years. And as new cars get more costly to produce, something else has started happening in the market. Used cars are getting dramatically more expensive. According to the Mannheim Used Vehicle Value Index, used vehicle prices surged roughly 40% between 2020 and 2022. That kind of jump is almost unheard of in the auto industry. And it reflects a deeper problem. When fewer cheap new cars are being built, the supply of affordable used cars also begins to shrink. So buyers who once relied on entry-level vehicles are now competing for a smaller and smaller pool of options. And that pressure is pushing prices higher across the entire market. So what does all of this mean for drivers today? It means we may be living in the final years of something most people took for granted for decades: the cheap, simple gasoline car. For most of modern automotive history, entry-level cars were the foundation of the market. They were smaller, lighter, and built with relatively simple engineering. Fewer sensors, fewer computers, fewer expensive systems that could break. Cars like the Toyota Corolla, the Honda Civic, and the Nissan Versa built their reputation on exactly that formula. They were reliable, they were affordable, and they were designed to last. For millions of drivers, these vehicles were the gateway to car ownership. But the forces reshaping the auto industry are making cars like these harder to build every year. New safety mandates add electronics. Fuel economy regulations reshape vehicle design. Electric vehicle policies push manufacturers toward entirely new platforms. At the same time, labor, materials, and technology costs are all rising. Put all of that together, and the result is simple. Automakers are moving away from cheap entry-level cars. They are focusing on larger vehicles, higher-priced models, and electric platforms where the profit margins are bigger. That shift is already visible across the industry. Affordable sedans like the Hyundai Elantra still exist today, but the number of truly inexpensive new cars is shrinking. And when fewer cheap cars are produced, something interesting begins to happen. The existing ones become more valuable. We already saw a preview of this during the pandemic, when used car prices surged across the country. Vehicles that once depreciated quickly suddenly held their value. Some even increased in price. That's why many mechanics are starting to give the same advice. If you own a reliable, simple gasoline car, it might be worth keeping. Because the truth is, the auto market is changing faster than most drivers realize, and the era of the cheap car may be quietly coming to an end.